This article considers the detailed timeline of events before, during, and after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. Timeline. Prelude. A presidential visit to the state of Texas was first agreed upon by Lyndon B. Johnson, President John F. Kennedy's vice president, and Texas native, and by Governor John Connally while all three men were together in a meeting in El Paso on June 5, 1963. President Kennedy later decided to embark on the trip with three basic goals in mind. The president wanted to help raise more Democratic Party presidential campaign fund contributions. He wanted to begin his quest for re-election in November 1964. And, because the Kennedy-Johnson ticket had barely won Texas in 1960, President Kennedy wanted to help mend political fences among several leading Texas Democratic Party members who appeared to be fighting politically amongst themselves. President Kennedy's trip to Dallas was first announced to the public in September 1963. The exact motorcade route was finalized on November 18 and announced to the public a few days before November 22. During the third week of October 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald started working a seasonal, full-time job at the Texas School Book Depository as a $1.25 per hour manual laborer, filling customer orders for books. Oswald had secured the job after a referral by Ruth Payne, with whom Lee's wife, Marina Oswald, and the Oswald children were living, after a marriage separation. Ruth had also separated from her husband, Michael Payne, at about the same time. On October 24, 1963, when on a visit to Dallas to mark UN Day, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was jeered, jostled, hit by a sign, and spat upon. Dallas police were fearful that similar demonstrations were going to happen to Kennedy when he visited Dallas. Several people, including Stevenson, warned JFK against coming to Dallas, but Kennedy refused their advice. Dallas police, headed by Chief Jesse Curry, did increase the level of security during Kennedy's visit, putting into effect the most stringent security precautions in the city's history. Curry even deputized citizens to take action for any suspicious acts that may be pointed towards the president. President Kennedy's Texas trip schedule. Thursday, November 21. San Antonio, dedication speech for U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base. Houston, testimonial dinner at the Rice Hotel, honoring Congressman Albert Thomas. Fort Worth, arrival at Hotel Texas. Friday, November 22. Fort Worth, Chamber of Commerce breakfast speech at Hotel Texas. Dallas, luncheon speech attended by Dallas Citizens Council, Dallas Assembly and Graduate Research Center of the Southwest at Trade Mart. Austin, fundraising dinner speech at Municipal Auditorium. Johnson City, weekend of relaxation at Lyndon Johnson's ranch. November 22, arrival in Dallas, on Friday, November 22, 1963, at 11:38 a.m. Central Standard Time, Kennedy, his wife Jacqueline, and the rest of the presidential entourage arrived at Love Field in northwest Dallas aboard Air Force One after a very short flight from nearby Carswell Air Force Base, west of Fort Worth. The motorcade cars had been lined up in a certain order earlier that morning. The original schedule was for the president to proceed in a long motorcade from Love Field through downtown Dallas, and end at the Dallas Business and Trade Mart. The motorcade was scheduled to enter Dealey Plaza at 12:10 p.m., followed by a 12:15 p.m. arrival at the Dallas Business and Trade Mart so President Kennedy could deliver a speech and share an steak luncheon with Dallas government, business, religious, and civic leaders and their spouses. Invitations that were sent out specify a noon start time to the luncheon, while SS Agent Lawson told Chief Curry that after arriving at Love Field and leaving at 11:30 the 38 to 45-minute trip would get them to the Trade Mart on time. Air Force One touched down at 11:39 a.m. and the presidential motorcade did not leave Love Field until approximately 15 minutes later. Dallas-Fort Worth television stations were given separate assignments. As Bob Walker of WFAA-TV8 was providing live coverage of the president's arrival at Love Field, KRLD TV4 with Eddie Barker was set up at the Trade Mart for Kennedy's luncheon speech. KTVT Channel 11 had originated live coverage of the president's breakfast speech in Fort Worth earlier that day. On hand to report the arrival on radio was Joe Long of KLIF 1190. Motorcade vehicles and personal equals. The following lists the order of the vehicles in the November 22, 1963 Dallas presidential motorcade, along with their occupants, the lead car, an unmarked white Ford, Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry, S.A. Winston Lawson, Dallas County Sheriff Bill Decker, SAIC Forrest Sorrells. Presidential limousine, a 1961 Lincoln Continental, driver agent William Greer, ASAIC Roy Kellerman, in charge of the White House detail for the Texas trip, Nellie Connolly, Governor John Connolly, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy. Motorcycle escorts for the presidential limousine, Dallas Police Officer Billy Joe Martin, Dallas Police Officer Robert W. Bobby Hargis, Dallas Police Officer James M. Chaney, Dallas Police Officer Douglas L. Jackson. Presidential Secret Service follow-up car, a 1956 Cadillac convertible codenamed Halfback driver agent Sam Kinney, ATSEC Emery Roberts, S.A. Clint Hill, in charge of the First Lady's security, S.A. William T. McIntyre, S.A. Jack Reddy, S.A. Paul Landis, Presidential Aide Kenneth O'Donnell, Presidential Aide David Powers, Driver Agent George Hickey, S.A. Glenn Bennett. Vice Presidential car, a Lincoln convertible, Texas State Policeman Herschel Jacks, ASAIC Rufus Youngblood, Senator Ralph Yarborough, Second Lady Lady Bird Johnson, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Vice Presidential Secret Service follow-up car, a Mercury hardtop codenamed Varsity, Texas State Policeman Joe Henry Rich, Vice Presidential Aide Cliff Carter, S.A. Jerry Covitt, S.A. Woody Taylor, ATSEC Lem Johns. Mayor's car, a Mercury convertible, Texas State Policeman Milton T. Wright, Dallas Mayor, Earl Cabell Mrs. Earl Cabell, Texas Congressman, Ray Roberts. National Press Pool car, a Chevrolet hardtop, telephone company employee, Malcolm Kilduff, White House Assistant Press Secretary. For this trip, Kilduff was substituting for Pierre Salinger, who was traveling to Japan with several cabinet officers, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Merriman Smith, UPI, Robert Baskin, The Dallas Morning News, Jack Bell, AP, Bob Clark, ABC. Camera car number 1, a Chevrolet convertible, Texas State Policeman Harlan EVC, John Hofan, NBC, Dave Weidman, NBC, Thomas Craven, CBS, Cleveland Ryan, Thomas Ollie Atkins, U.S. Navy. Camera car number 2, a Chevrolet convertible, driver, Clint Grant, Dallas Morning News, Frank Chancellor, UPI, Cecil Stoughton, White House, Arthur B. Rickaby, Life, Henry Burroughs, AP. Camera car number 3, a Chevrolet convertible, an employee of the Department of Public Safety, Jim Underwood, Assistant News Director for KRLD TV and KRLD Radio, Tom Dillard, The Dallas Morning News, James Darnell, WBAP-TV, Malcolm Couch, WFAA-TV, Bob Jackson, The Dallas Times-Herald. Congressman's car number 1, a Mercury convertible, driver, Congressman George H. Mahon, Congressman Walter E. Rogers, Congressman Homer Thornberry, Larry O'Brien, Special Assistant to the President. Congressman's car number 2, a Mercury convertible, driver, Congressman Albert Thomas, Congressman Jack Brooks, Congressman Lindley Beckworth, Congressman Olin Teague, Congressman Jim Wright. Congressman's car number 3, a Lincoln sedan, driver, Congressman John Young, Congressman Henry Gonzalez, State Senator William Patman, Congressman Graham Purcell. VIP car, a Mercury station wagon, Major General Ted Clifton, U.S. Army, Presidential Military Aide, Major General Godfrey McHugh, USAF, Presidential Military Aide, Julian Reed, Governor Connolly's press secretary. 2 press buses, a local press car, a Western Union car, the White House Signal Corps car, the official party bus, several extra cars, and police escorts follow. Abbreviations used above include SA Secret Service Special Agent, SAIC, Special Agent in Charge, ASAIC, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, ATSIC, Assistant to the Special Agent in Charge, Driver Agent. Secret Service driver agents operated through their own command chain. Driver agents were typically recruited from the uniformed White House police force. Presidential motorcade route. The route scheduled to be driven was as follows: left turn from the south end of Love Field to West Mockingbird Lane, right on Lemon Avenue, right at the Y on Turtle Creek Boulevard, straight on Cedar Springs Road, left on North Harwood Street, right on Main Street, right on Houston Street, sharp left on Elm Street, through Triple Underpass, right turn up ramp to North Stemmons Freeway, to Dallas Trade Mart at 2100 North Stemmons. The presidential motorcade began its route without incident, stopping twice so President Kennedy could shake hands with some Catholic nuns, then some schoolchildren. At 12:29 p.m. Central Standard Time, the presidential limousine entered Dealey Plaza after a 90-degree right turn from Main Street onto Houston Street. Over 24 known and unknown amateur and professional still and motion picture photographers captured the last living images of President Kennedy. Just before 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, President Kennedy was riding on Houston Street and slowly approached the Texas School Book Depository head-on. 12:30 p.m. Shots are fired. According to witnesses, the shooting began shortly after the limousine made the sharp left-hand turn from Houston onto Elm Street. Most of these witnesses recalled the first shot happened after the president had started waving with his right hand. Most of these witnesses recalled hearing 3 shots, with the second and third shots bunched distinctly much closer together than the first and second shots. As seen in the Zapruder film, when the president first emerges from being temporarily hidden from Zapruder's camera behind the Stemmons Freeway sign at Zapruder film frame 224 to 225, his mouth is already widely opened in an anguished expression to his already having been impacted with a bullet, and his hands clench into fists. He then quickly raised his fists dramatically in front of his face and throat as he turned leftwards towards his wife. Secret Service agent Clint Hill testified that he heard 1 shot, then jumped off the running board of the Secret Service follow-up car directly behind Kennedy. Hill then rapidly ran towards the presidential limo and then a shot hit Kennedy in the head, opening up the right side of his head. As the limousine began speeding up, Mrs. Kennedy was heard to scream and she climbed out of the back seat onto the rear of the limo. At the same time, Hill managed to climb aboard and hang on to the suddenly accelerating limo, and Mrs. Kennedy returned to the back seat. Hill then shielded her and the president. Both of the Connollys stated they heard Mrs. Kennedy say, "I have his brains in my hand." The limo driver and police motorcycles turned on their sirens and raced at high speeds to Parkland Hospital, passing their intended destination of the Dallas Trade Mart along the way, and arriving at about 12:38 p.m. During the shots, Governor Connolly was also struck, and his wife pulled him closer to her. He suffered several severe wounds that he survived. A bullet entry wound in his upper right back located just behind his right armpit. 4 inches of his right, 5th chest rib was pulverized. A 2.5-inch sized chest exit wound. His right arm's wrist bone was fractured into 7 pieces. And he had a bullet entry wound in his left inner thigh. Although there is controversy about exactly when he was wounded, analysts from both the Warren Commission and House Select Committee on Assassinations believe that his wounds had been inflicted nearly simultaneously with President Kennedy's, and their theories that the 2 men were struck by a single bullet. The commission theorized both men were hit nearly simultaneously between Zapruder film frames 210 to 225, while the committee theorized it happened at frame 190. During the shots, a witness, James Tague, was also injured when he received a minor facial wound. The Main Street South Cobe he had been standing 23.5 feet away from was struck by a bullet or bullet fragment that had no copper sheath, and a fragment of the concrete curb or a bullet fragment struck Tague on his right cheek. At Zapruder frame 313 Takeu's head top was located 271 feet away from and 16.4 feet below President Kennedy's head top and the limousine's front windshield, and it's pushed nearly vertically straight upwards. Some visors were in between the president and the impacted curb point. The bullet or bullet fragment that struck the concrete curb was never found. Immediate aftermath. Lee Harvey Oswald Lee Harvey Oswald was encountered by an armed Dallas policeman, Marion Baker, in the Texas School Book Depository Building's second-floor lunchroom 74 to 90 seconds after the last shot. Baker was assigned to serve as a motorcycle escort for the motorcade, riding just behind the camera cars. He testified that the first shot he could hear was fired after he turned from Main Street onto Houston Street and had traveled approximately 60 to 80 feet along Houston as he approached the Houston and Elm Streets intersection. Baker stated that he recognized the first shot he could hear as the report of a high-powered rifle and that he thought the shots had originated from the building, either right in front of me, the depository, or the one across to the right of it, the Dallas Textile Building. He said he also noticed pigeons take flight up from the roof of the depository building and start flying around. Baker then quickly drove to the corner of Houston and Elm Street, parked his motorcycle, then looked westward into the aftermath of persons screaming, running and laying on the ground. Then he listened to a radio broadcast by Chief Curry saying, "Get some men up on that railroad track." Then he ran to the entrance of the Texas School Book Depository, entered the building, and, led by Building Superintendent Roy Truly, made his way to the far northwest corner of the first floor. Once they reached there, they started yelling for someone to send an elevator down from a higher floor. When there was no response, he and Truly began climbing the stairs with Truly in the lead. Upon stepping out onto the second floor, a movement caught Baker's attention towards the lunchroom vestibule that was across from the stairs. Baker drew his weapon, went to the outer lunchroom vestibule and confronted Oswald, but Baker released Oswald when Oswald was identified as an employee by Mr. Truly. According to Baker, Oswald did not appear to be nervous or out of breath. Truly said that Oswald appeared startled when Baker aimed his gun at him. According to the Warren Commission, Oswald was next seen by a depository secretary as he crossed through the second-floor business office carrying a soda bottle. He left the Texas School Book Depository at an estimated 12:33 p.m. through its front door. The Warren Commission theorized that Oswald had traveled from the sixth-floor easternmost window, and hid an 8-pound, Italian-made 1940 Cassano, 6.5mm rifle equipped with a 4-power scope along the way. The rifle was reportedly discovered near the sixth-floor northwest corner by a Dallas police detective at 1:22 p.m., having been placed down between stacks of boxes, balanced upright on the lowest edges of its barrel and wooden stock. After being discovered, the rifle was photographed before being touched and was filmed while it was being inspected by the police crime lab supervisor. Estimates of when the depository building was sealed off by police range from 12:33 to 12:50 p.m. The Delhi Plaza immediate area streets and blocks were never sealed off, and 9 minutes after the assassination, photographs show that vehicles were still driving unhampered down Elm Street, through the crime scene kill zone. After leaving the depository, Oswald walked 7 blocks before boarding a bus. When the bus got stuck in traffic, he got off, walked to a nearby bus station, entered a taxi, took it several blocks past his rooming house, and then walked back to the rooming house. He arrived at his rooming house at around 1 p.m. according to his housekeeper Eileen Roberts. He left 3 or 4 minutes later. She last saw him standing and waiting at a bus stop outside the rooming house. At 1:15 p.m., Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was shot dead near the intersection of 10th Street and Patton Avenue. This was 0.86 miles from Oswald's rooming house. 13 people witnessed the man shooting Tippit or fleeing the immediate scene. By that evening, 5 of the witnesses had identified Oswald in police lineups, and a 6th identified him the following day. 4 others subsequently identified Oswald from a photograph. After the Tippit murder, Oswald was witnessed traveling on foot toward the Texas Theater on West Jefferson Boulevard. About 1:35 p.m. Johnny Calvin Brewer, who worked as a manager at Hardee's shoe store in the same block as the Texas Theater on Jefferson Boulevard, saw Oswald turning his face away from the street and ducking to the entranceway of the shoe store as Dallas squad cars drove up the street with sirens on. When Oswald left the store, Brewer followed Oswald and watched him go into the Texas Theater movie house without paying while ticket attendant Julie Postal was distracted. Brewer notified Postal, who in turn informed the Dallas police at 1:40 p.m. Almost 24 policemen, sheriffs, and detectives in several patrol cars arrived at Texas Theater because they believed Tippett's killer was inside. When an arrest attempt was made at 1:50 p.m. inside the theater, Oswald resisted arrest and, according to the police, attempted to shoot a patrolman after yelling once, "Well, it's all over now," then punching a patrolman. President Kennedy at Parkland Hospital, a Roman Catholic priest was summoned to perform the last rites for President Kennedy. Dr. Malcolm Perry, assistant professor of surgery at UT Southwestern and a vascular surgeon on the Parkland staff, was the first to treat Kennedy, and he performed a tracheotomy, followed by a cardiopulmonary resuscitation performed with another surgeon. Other doctors and surgeons who gathered worked frantically to save the president's life, but his wounds were too great. At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, after all the activity had ceased, and after the priest administered the last rites, President Kennedy was pronounced dead. Personnel at Parkland Hospital Trauma Room No. 1, who treated the president, observed that the president's condition was moribund, meaning he had no chance of survival upon arrival at the hospital. "We never had any hope of saving his life," Dr. Perry said. "I am absolutely sure he never knew what hit him," said Dr. Tom Shires, Parkland's chief of surgery. The Very Reverend Oscar L. Huber, the priest who administered the last rites to the president, told the New York Times that the president was already dead upon the priest's arrival at the hospital and had to draw back a sheet covering the president's face so that the last rites could be given. Governor Connolly, meanwhile, was soon taken to emergency surgery where he underwent 2 operations that day. Although President Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, the official announcement would not come until more than half an hour later. After receiving word of the president's death, acting White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff entered the room where Vice President Johnson, who was constitutionally now the president, and his wife were sitting. Kilduff approached them and said to Johnson, "Mr. President, I have to announce the death of President Kennedy. Is it okay with you that the announcement be made now?" The new president ordered that the announcement be made only after he left the hospital. When asking that the announcement be delayed, Johnson told Kilduff, "I think I had better get out of here before you announce it. We don't know whether this is a worldwide conspiracy, whether they are after me as well as they were after President Kennedy, or whether they are after Speaker McCormack, or Senator Hayden. We just don't know." At 1:33 p.m. Central Standard Time, Malcolm Kilduff entered a nurse's classroom at the hospital filled with press reporters and made the official announcement. A few minutes after 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, President Kennedy's body was removed from Parkland Hospital and driven straight to Air Force One. The removal occurred subsequent to a 10 to 15-minute angry confrontation between Kennedy's special assistant Ken O'Donnell with Parkland Hospital doctors and medical examiner driver Earl Rose, along with a justice of the peace. The removal of President Kennedy's body may have been illegal, as it was done before a forensic examination could be performed by the Dallas coroner, which was against Texas state laws. The assassination of the president was, at that time, listed on the books as a state-level crime and not a federal one, and as such legally occurred under Texas jurisdiction. To this date, however, no official legal body has ruled on this matter. Breaking the news. Locally in Dallas. From Dallas, local listeners of top-rated Top 40 music station KLIF Radio were listening to The Rex Jones Show when they received the first bulletin at approximately 12:38 p.m. Central Standard Time. A bulletin alert sounder faded in during the song I Have a Boyfriend by the Chiffons. The song was stopped and newscaster Gary DeLon made the first announcement over the bulletin signal. Down the dial, Dallas CBS radio affiliate KRLD had just concluded coverage of the presidential party's arrival at Love Field, followed by reporter Bob Huffaker's coverage of the motorcade from the corner of Main and Arcade Streets in the downtown area. Shortly after returning to regular programming with the nationally syndicated religious program Back to the Bible, the first reports of the shooting came through. WBAP played instrumental music, with interruptions for local bulletins, until NBC Radio's continuous coverage began. Dallas ABC television affiliate WFAA was airing a local lifestyle program, The Julie Bennell Show, at the time. At 12:45 p.m. Central Standard Time, the station abruptly cut from the pre-recorded program to news director Jay Watson in the studio, who had been at Dealey Plaza and ran back to the station following the incident. Watson then began anchoring continuous coverage of the tragedy with Jerry Haynes, better known as WFAA TV children's TV show host Mr. Peppermint, followed shortly by an interview with witnesses Bill and Gail Newman. Other stations. In addition to the local Dallas radio and television coverage, recordings exist of coverage by various other radio stations nationwide. Four such stations are WTIC in Hartford, Connecticut; WLW in Cincinnati, Ohio; WCCO in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota; and KNX in Los Angeles, California. CBS radio affiliates KNX, WCCO, and WCBS, KNX and WCCO both had local bulletins interrupting programming prior to the first CBS radio network bulletin. Both stations momentarily returned to their scheduled programs after those bulletins. On KNX, it was the West Coast network feed of that morning's Arthur Godfrey Time program, while WCCO switched back to its agribusiness news hour in the middle of a commercial for a St. Paul stockyard and slaughterhouse. When the news broke, WCBS in New York was in the middle of an interview with a local family court judge on the topic of juvenile delinquency. After the local bulletin announced by newsman Joseph Dembo, the interview resumed, with both interviewer and interviewee briefly acknowledging the shocking news, until the first CBS Radio Net Alert bulletin interrupted. NBC radio affiliate WLW in Cincinnati, one of the longest recordings exists from Cincinnati's WLW, then affiliated with NBC's Radio News Division and aired the 5-minute national newscasts the station provided every half hour. The 1:30 Eastern Standard Time newscast, apparently a tape delay of the 1 p.m. network newscast, was anchored by Martin Agnieszki. As Kennedy was to have been delivering his speech at the Trade Mart at precisely that time, Agnieszki described the speech in the past tense, as if it had already been delivered. Following the update, WLW began its regular Tune-Pike program, with disc jockey Fred Bernard playing mainly Broadway musical songs. At approximately 1:37 p.m., the planned playing of the original cast album to the 1956 musical Lyle Abner was momentarily delayed by Bernard. After the flash was read and recapped, Bernard tried to return to the music. However, the overture to Lyle Abner was interrupted several times. After the first interruption, two staff members in WLW's news office were overheard conversing. This was immediately followed by a bulletin from the WLW newsroom, which was their first official bulletin and was read as follows. WLW also interrupted to air an NBC network hotline bulletin. After the Lyle Abner overture ended, Bernard played instrumental music by Percy Faith for some time before switching to NBC's nationwide radio coverage of the incident, adding relevant information where necessary. NBC radio affiliate WTIC in Hartford, WTIC did not interrupt its local call and listener question and answer program Mike Line until nearly 1:55 p.m. Eastern Standard Time when guest host and WTIC TV, Channel 3, evening news anchor Bob Ellsworth was handed his first bulletin. From that point forward, he and Mike Line co-host Floyd Richards took turns reading the latest information from the wire services until the 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time NBC Radio Network newscast, which was anchored from Washington, D.C. by Peter Hacks, with White House correspondent Robert McNeil reporting by phone from Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. WTIC staff announcer Dick Bertel took the air from when the NBC newscast concluded at 2:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time until shortly before 2:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time when NBC News first offered continuous coverage to WTIC, WLW, and its other radio affiliates nationwide, anchored mainly by Edwin Newman from New York. WGN in Chicago, the only record of JFK assassination coverage currently available from a Chicago radio station comes from a non-network station, WGN. Host Ryan Samuelson was on the air with Country Fare, a program of agricultural news, when the first bulletins were received. After reading the bulletins, Samuelson resumed the regularly scheduled program, periodically interrupting with further bulletins, until a Union record turner arrived and Samuelson was able to end his program, at which time the station began playing somber easy listening instrumental music as staff and listeners awaited further bulletins. Samuelson recalled years later that he had initially thought fellow staffers were playing a joke on him with the initial bulletins about the shooting, until he realized it was real. WGBH-FM Boston Symphony Orchestra concert. The Boston Symphony Orchestra was performing a concert at Boston Symphony Hall when conductor Eric Leinsdorf announced the tragic news to the audience and a last-minute program change replacing a suite from Rimsky-Korsakov's The Golden Cockerel with the Marcia Funebra from Ludwig van Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. A recording of the announcement exists due to the concert being simulcast over non-commercial public radio station WGBH-FM. Nationally The first national news bulletin of the shooting came over the ABC radio network at 12:36 p.m. Central Standard Time / 1:36 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The most complete recording of the initial ABC bulletins come from WRUL, a New York-based station transmitting to Latin America and Europe on shortwave, which was featuring a program of or album music when the shooting took place. At the time, Doris Day's recording of Hooray for Hollywood was playing when newscaster Don Gardner broke in with the developments. 4 minutes following ABC's radio bulletin, CBS was the first to break the news over television at 12:40 p.m. Central Standard Time / 1:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The network interrupted its live broadcast of As the World Turns with a CBS News Bulletin bumper slide and Walter Cronkite filed an audio-only report over it as no camera was available at the time. Cronkite remained at the CBS anchor desk the entire time and later filed 2 additional audio-only bulletins to interrupt programming, the last of which preempted the remaining running time of As the World Turns. At that time, the ABC and NBC television networks weren't on the air in the Eastern and Central time zones. Various programs were being broadcast through their affiliate stations. From their main headquarters in New York, WABC-TV's first bulletin came from Ed Silverman at 1:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, also interrupting a rerun of Father Knows Best in the Mountain Time Zone on the ABC-TV network. ABC-TV was not feeding programming to its affiliates in the Pacific time zone at that hour. 3 minutes later, Don Pardo broke into WNBC-TV's local rerun of Bachelor Father with the news, saying President Kennedy was shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She cried, "Oh no!" The motorcade sped on at 1:53 p.m. NBC broke into programming with the NBC network bumper slide and Chet Huntley, Bill Ryan, and Frank McGee informing the viewers what was going on as it happened. However, NBC's camera was not ready and the coverage was limited to audio-only reports as CBS coverage had been to that point. Other than for 2 audio-only bulletins, ABC did not break into its station's programming at all, instead waiting until the network was to return to broadcasting at 2 p.m. Eastern to begin its coverage. At 1:57 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, while Ryan was speaking, NBC began broadcasting the report as their camera was ready and working. 3 minutes later, at 2 Eastern Standard Time, CBS camera was finally ready and Cronkite appeared on the air after a brief station break, with ABC beginning its coverage at the same time. Radio coverage was reported by Don Gardner, Alan Jackson, and by Peter Hacks and Edwin Newman. Television and radio coverage. ABC Providing the reports for ABC television were Don Goddard, Ron Cochran, and Ed Silverman in New York, Edward P. Morgan in Washington, Bob Clark from Parkland Hospital, and Bill Lord from the Dallas County Sheriff's Office. As with the other networks, ABC interspersed with their Dallas affiliate WFAA-TV8 for up-to-date information. Reporting from WFAA were Bob Walker and Jay Watson. They were later joined by Bob Clark upon his arrival from the hospital. ABC's initial coverage of the incident was very disorganized. Cochran, ABC's primary news anchor, was called back to the studio while out having lunch and had to hurry back to begin his reporting. Silverman was the voice accompanying ABC's first bulletin, broadcast during a rerun episode of Father Knows Best that was airing on a majority of the network's affiliates in the Mountain Time Zone at the time. The surviving videotape of ABC's initial bulletins appears to have been recorded by then-affiliate KTVK in Phoenix, as it contains the interruption of Father Knows Best. The first on-camera report was given by Goddard in the network's news studio, which was too far away from the teletype machines. Goddard then moved to the newsroom and was joined by the returning Cochran, and the technical crew began constructing an impromptu news set around them. Cochran and Goddard were forced to stand and awkwardly hold microphones and headsets so they could report the information. In addition to the disorganization in New York, ABC was not able to switch to Dallas to speak to its correspondents. Only one feed was available to them at first, which came from the Dallas Trade Mart and CBS affiliate KRLD reporter Eddie Barker. CBS had earlier aired snippets of Barker's report, but had cut it off to return to its own reporting of the incident before Barker finished. ABC aired the remainder of the report until the end. The reason that ABC was able to air the CBS affiliate's coverage was due to a pool arrangement the three major Dallas stations agreed to for the president's visit. WBAP was responsible for covering the president's visit to Fort Worth and his departure and landing at Love Field, WFAA was assigned to cover the parade through downtown Dallas, and KRLD was set up at the Dallas Trade Mart for the address the president was to give. At 2:25 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, while attempting to switch to Bob Clark in Dallas, ABC Radio reported that Parkland Hospital said President Kennedy was dead, and then stressed that it was unconfirmed. Upon reporting the news, anchor Don Gardner said this to his audience. ABC Radio then stopped coverage to broadcast orchestral music. At 2:33 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Cochran reported on ABC television that the two priests who were called into the hospital to administer the last rites to the president said that he had died from his wounds. Although this was an unconfirmed report, ABC prematurely placed a photo of the president with the words John F. Kennedy, 1917–1963 on the screen. 5 minutes later, this photo was again prematurely placed when Cochran received an erroneous report that the president had died at 1:35 p.m. Central Standard Time when, in fact, he had died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. A few minutes following that, Cochran received further information regarding the president's condition and relayed the following to the ABC viewing audience. On ABC Radio, Gardner reported the news, but did not say whether or not it was official. ABC then switched to Pete Clapper on Capitol Hill for an interview with the Senate's press liaison. Moments later, the interview was interrupted by Gardner's report of the president's death. ABC Radio then returned to orchestral music. CBS From the time the CBS affiliates joined Walter Cronkite in the newsroom at around 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to approximately 2:38 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the coverage alternated from the CBS newsroom to KRLD-TV's Eddie Barker at the Dallas Trade Mart where President Kennedy was to give his luncheon address. In the 15 to 20 minutes before Gilduff's official announcement, rumors of the president's death were broadcast on radio and TV. At approximately 2:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, CBS News correspondent Dan Rather telephoned one of the two priests who performed last rites on Kennedy to confirm that he had indeed been shot. "Yes, he's been shot and he is dead," the priest told Rather. Almost simultaneously at the Trade Mart, a doctor went up to Barker and whispered, "Eddie, he is dead. I called the emergency room and he is DOA." Moments later, As the news cameras panned throughout the Trade Mart crowds, Barker gave this report. Several minutes later, when CBS switched back to KRLD and the Trade Mart for another report, Barker repeated the claim of the president's death, adding the source would normally be a good one. During this report, as Barker was speaking of security precautions for the president's visit, a Trade Mart employee was shown removing the presidential seal from the podium where President Kennedy was to speak. CBS Radio, meanwhile, rather proceeded to telephone CBS News officials in New York, telling executive Mort Dank, "I think he's dead." Despite the unofficial nature of their unregistered trademark report, CBS Radio newsroom supervisor Robert Skettle wrote JFK dead on a slip of paper and handed it to CBS Radio News anchor Alan Jackson. At 2:22 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 11 minutes before Kilduff's official announcement, Jackson made the following announcement. After the announcement, CBS Radio, apparently trying to play the Star-Spangled Banner, inadvertently aired a brief excerpt of an LP Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings played at the wrong speed of 78 RPMs. After a few seconds of silence, Jackson repeated the news colon. This was followed by an excerpt from the first movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. After the music, Jackson again repeated the news colon. After Jackson's announcement, his co-anchor Dallas Townsend added, Townsend's comment was followed by the Star-Spangled Banner. CBS TV, while CBS Radio had taken this to be confirmation of the president's death, there was a debate going on between CBS television network officials as to whether or not to report this development, as Rother's report was not a truly official confirmation. At 2:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, they decided to give Rother's report to Cronkite, who relayed this to the nation. Then, at approximately 2:32 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, one of the newsroom staff members rushed to Cronkite's desk with another bulletin. As Cronkite read the bulletin, he had to reread it as he stumbled over his words. Although Cronkite continued to stress that there was no official confirmation, the tone of Cronkite's words seemed to indicate that it would only be a matter of time before the official word came. 3 minutes later, he received the same report that ABC's Ron Cochran chose to relay as official word. Cronkite did not do the same, reporting it instead. In this context, Cronkite continued as before while still awaiting word of the official confirmation of the president's death, which at this time had been relayed by Kilduff at the hospital 2 minutes prior but had not made the press wires yet. After speaking about what Kennedy had done earlier that day in Fort Worth, Cronkite noted that the plane from Fort Worth flew the president to his rendezvous with death, apparently, in Dallas, although the official bulletin still had not arrived yet. Immediately after that, at 2:38 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Cronkite remarked on fearful concerns of demonstrations in Dallas similar to the attack of UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson in Dallas the previous month. At that moment, a CBS News employee seen in the background pulled off a sheet from the AP News ticker. He quickly relayed it to Cronkite, who put on his glasses, took a few seconds to read the sheet, and made the announcement. After reading the flash, Cronkite took off his glasses so he could consult the studio clock, which established the lapse in time since Kennedy had died. He paused briefly and replaced his eyeglasses, visibly moved for a moment. Cronkite continued, there was a sense of irony to CBS coverage of the assassination. On September 2, 1963, Kennedy gave an interview with Cronkite, helping CBS inaugurate network television's first half-hour evening newscast. It should perhaps be noted that CBS did not include any further coverage from Dallas or Washington as the other networks had until after the announcement of Kennedy's death. As coverage continued following the announcement, Charles Collingwood relieved Cronkite in New York while Neil Strauzer reported from CBS Washington Bureau and Dan Rather and Eddie Barker provided reports from KRLD in Dallas. =NBC=, at NBC TV, Chet Huntley, Bill Ryan, and Frank Muggy anchored from the network's emergency flash studio in New York, with reports from David Brinkley in Washington, Charles Murphy and Tom Whelan from NBC affiliate WBAP-TV in Fort Worth, Texas, and Robert McNeil, who had been in the motorcade, at Parkland Hospital. Edwin Newman reported from NBC Radio with periodic simulcast with NBC TV. NBC Radio's coverage was simulcast in Canada by CBC Radio. Also, the United States international shortwave broadcaster, Voice of America, relayed portions of NBC's coverage as part of its English-language coverage of the tragic news. Throughout the first 35 minutes, there were technical difficulties with the Fort Worth TV relay as well as with the phone link McNeil was using to report from the hospital. When the coverage began, McGee was waiting for McNeil to call in with information. While Ryan and Huntley were recounting the information, McGee got McNeil on the line and told him to recount chronologically what happened. However, NBC was using a studio that wasn't equipped to patch calls through to the air and McNeil wasn't able to be heard in the studio. McGee then decided to have McNeil speak slowly and relay what he said in fragments. While McGee and McNeil were talking, Huntley was handed a speaker and attached it to the phone's receiver, enabling McNeil to be heard. However, by that time there was no further information to report. McNeil had a medical student from Parkland hold the phone line for him so that he could return to the emergency ward for the latest developments. At approximately 2:35 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Huntley alluded to the last time a president had died in office. Ryan then broke in with the first unofficial report of the president's death. McGee then relayed to Ryan that Vice President and Mrs. Johnson had left the hospital just before the AP flash, which Ryan said might well be confirmation of it. On NBC Radio and CBC Radio, Newman reported the same flash. At that point, both radio networks rejoined NBC TV, which immediately returned to Charles Murphy in Fort Worth for possible confirmation of the flash. Murphy reported that the Dallas police had been informed of the president's death just moments before on their radios, although this was still not confirmed. As television coverage returned to New York, McGee announced that Robert McNeil, who had just returned from the press conference that acting press secretary Malcolm Kilduff called to announce the death of President Kennedy, was back on the phone with a new report. McGee began relaying McNeil's information in fragments as he did with the previous reports, then the audio came in, allowing McNeil to be heard in the studio. However, McGee was unaware of this and, for the next 4 minutes, he continued relaying the fragments for the remainder of the report. After McNeil finished giving all the relevant information available, he left the phone to obtain further information. McGee, wiping a tear from his eye, stood by and kept the phone line open for McNeil's next update. KLIF Radio, Dallas from local radio station KLIF, Gary DeLon relayed the bulletins as received with reports from Joe Long from KLIF News Mobile Unit No. 4. Long, who had reported the president's arrival at Love Field earlier, later joined DeLon in the studio. Roy Nichols took over the No. 4 mobile unit and headed for Parkland Hospital. After a report from the Trade Mart, radio broadcaster and KLIF founder Gordon McClendon returned to the radio station to relieve DeLon. The reporters continuously stressed, as a strict radio station rule of McClendon's, whether the information received is from official or unofficial sources, especially concerning reports of the president's death. At approximately 1:38 p.m. Central Standard Time, KLIF's teletype sounded 10 bells and Long was given the official flash. Gordon McClendon, the president is clearly, gravely, critically, and perhaps fatally wounded. There are strong indications that he may already have expired, although that is not official, we repeat, not official. But, the extent of the injuries to Governor Connally is, a closely shrouded secret at the moment. Joe Long, President Kennedy is dead, Gordon. This is official word. Gordon McClendon, ladies and gentlemen, the president is dead. The president, ladies and gentlemen, is dead at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Following the official announcement of President Kennedy's death, all three networks canceled their regular programming and commercials for the first time in the short history of television and ran coverage on a non-stop basis for 4 days. The assassination of President Kennedy was the longest uninterrupted news event in the history of American television until just before 9 a.m. EDT, September 11, 2001, when the networks were on the air for 72 hours straight covering the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Return to Washington, Once back at Air Force One, and only after Mrs. Kennedy and President Kennedy's unregistered trademark S-body had also returned to the plane, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in by Sarah T. Hughes as the 36th President of the United States of America at 2:38 p.m. Central Standard Time. One of President Kennedy's aides stayed with his coffin during the swearing-in of Johnson. At about 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Air Force One arrived at Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C. The television networks made the switch to the AFB just as the plane touched down. Reporting the arrival for the TV networks were Richard Bate, Charles von Fremd, and Bob Abernethy and Nancy Dickerson. After President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, boarded the plane, Kennedy's casket was removed from the rear entrance and loaded into a light gray U.S. Navy ambulance for its transport to the Bethesda Naval Hospital for an autopsy and mortician's preparations. When Jackie Kennedy stepped off the plane with her brother-in-law, her pink suit and legs were still stained with her husband's blood. All that long afternoon and into the early morning hours of the next day, the widow objected to leaving her husband's body, except for the swearing-in of Johnson. She also refused to change out of her blood-stained suit. Lady Bird Johnson, in her audio diary, quoted Mrs. Kennedy as saying, "I want them to see what they have done to Jack." Shortly after the ambulance with the casket and Mrs. Kennedy departed, President Johnson and the First Lady exited Air Force One. They were led to a podium clustered with microphones where Lyndon Johnson made his first official statement as President of the United States. President Johnson himself ordered the arrival to be televised live. While en route to Washington from Dallas, he and Kilduff told the other Assistant Press Secretary, Andrew Hatcher, that he was going to make his statement and that he wanted the arrival to be televised live. As the new president boarded his helicopter, he said that Mrs. Kennedy was in his heart and remarked about the presidency, and recounted, "Then the door of the helicopter slammed shut behind me and thus ended a tragic chapter in American history." Charges laid on Oswald. At 7:05 p.m. Central Standard Time, Lee Harvey Oswald was charged with murder with malice in the killing of police officer J.D. Tippit. At 11:26 p.m. Central Standard Time, Oswald was charged with the murder of President Kennedy and the furtherance of a communist conspiracy. On November 24, 1963, at 11:21 a.m. Central Standard Time, before live television cameras, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot and mortally wounded in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters by a local nightclub owner with mafia ties, Jack Ruby. Unconscious, Oswald was put into an ambulance and rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where doctors tried to save the life of John F. Kennedy 2 days earlier. Oswald died at 1:07 p.m. Funeral. The state funeral took place in Washington, D.C. during the 3 days that followed the assassination. The body of President Kennedy was brought back to Washington, D.C. and placed in the East Room of the White House for 24 hours. On the Sunday after the assassination, his coffin was carried on a horse-drawn Casson to the U.S. Capitol to Lyon State. Throughout the day and night, hundreds of thousands lined up to view the guarded casket. Representatives from over 90 countries attended the state funeral on Monday, November 25. After the Requiem Mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, the late president was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. Official investigations. The Warren Commission's 888-page final report was presented to President Johnson on September 24, 1964, and made public 3 days later, saying one shot wounded President Kennedy and Governor Connally, and a subsequent shot hit Kennedy in the head, killing him. The commission also concluded a third shot was fired, but made no conclusion as to whether it was the first, second or third shot fired. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald fired all 3 shots. References, inline citations. Bibliography, Associated Press. The Torch is Passed. New York, Associated Press. Johnson, Lyndon. The Vantage Point, Perspectives of the Presidency, 1963–1969. New York, Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. Miller, Merle. Lyndon, An Oral Biography. New York, Putnam. NBC News. There Was a President. New York, Random House. Trost, Kathy. Bennett, Susan. President Kennedy has been shot. Naperville, Illinois Sourcebooks. United Press International. American Heritage Magazine. 4 Days. New York, American Heritage Pub Company. Warren Commission. Report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Author United States. Washington, United States Government Printing Office. White, Theodore H. The Making of the President, 1965. New York, Atheneum Publishers. External links, timeline.com, Context to a Coup. Tribute to a Revolutionary Leader.